Hello, my name is Malvika and welcome to my channel. I am a former McKinsey consultant and today we will be talking about case interviews. The purpose of this video is to be a starter guide for anyone who is embarking on the recruiting process for any sort of consulting firm. So this video is relevant to anyone who's applying to McKinsey, Bain, BCG, several of the other consulting firms, Accenture, Deloitte, Oliver Wyman, all follow a very, very similar process. And there's other roles that might not necessarily be consulting, but other business analyst type roles that also have a case interview that is part of the process. And the reason why I'm making this video is I have done a lot of case interview preparation. So I was a candidate for McKinsey, Bain, and BCG in 2015 while I was a junior in college at UT Austin applying for their summer internship programs. During that process, obviously, I did my own preparation, but I also did a lot of practice cases with friends and peers who are applying to consulting jobs as well. After I actually joined McKinsey, I was part of campus recruiting team. So for example, UT Austin's campus recruiting team, where I was a mentor who ran practice cases with several of the incoming candidates in the process. And then in 2019, once I became a senior business analyst, I became formally interview trained. So that meant I could actually do first round, final round, power round interviews with analysts and associate candidates, which I did several of. And then in 2021, I left McKinsey, but then I actually joined the alumni recruiting program where I would do phone screen interviews for all sorts of experienced hire candidates. So all of that to say, I've done a lot of case interviews. I've prepped probably over 500 candidates at this point, as well as done a lot of actual interviews. So probably interviewed over 100 candidates. And I want to take everything I've seen in those hundreds of interviews and that preparation process and share it with all of you to help set you up for success in your own preparation for your case interview. This video is going to have 4 different sections. The first is going to be the format of the case interview, so what to expect for that. The second is going to be the types of case interview questions and a little bit of context of what is being asked and how you should think about answering it. The third is going to be what really makes a case shine. So once you know all the fundamentals, how do you add that extra sparkle that's going to make you really memorable as an interview candidate? And the final one is how to structure your case preparation process. There's a lot of resources available online, so this should hopefully help you streamline the next couple of weeks and how you prioritize your preparation. So let's jump into it. Okay, topic 1 is the format of the case. So here we'll talk about the general flow of what to expect during the case interview. Before the case part of the interview itself, you're going to have 2 other pieces of it typically. You're going to have introductions, so let's get to know you, tell me about yourself, maybe a little bit about why you want to go into consulting. You're going to have behavioral questions, which we won't actually cover today, and then you will get into the case, which is usually about 20 to 30 minutes long. So once we're pivoting to the case, usually I would, and I'm about to put my interviewer cap on and walk you through the case as if we were going through the interview. I would say something along the lines of, we're now jumping into the interview, the case part of this interview. This is a hypothetical client situation, and I want you to answer some questions with me based on the client context I give you. If you say that you're ready, then we'll jump into the client context. Within the client context, I would give you information about who the client is, what their objectives are, maybe some challenges that they're facing, any relevant details around their product or their industry. And then I would ask you sort of the big question for the case. What is the client looking to answer or get an answer from you on? This is very important. Write this question down because you want to tie back every other question, the answer that you give, back to this main question. After I ask this main question, I'm probably going to pause and say, do you have anything you'd like me to repeat or clarify? At this point, many candidates ask if they can repeat back some of the highlights of what they've heard in the context, which absolutely they can, to make sure that they've understood it correctly. And if there's anything that you do need repeated or clarified, say you didn't understand one of the industry terms or you might have missed a number, absolutely ask it here because it's important that you have this context right to set yourself up for success in the actual case. So after we have clarified everything and we're good to go there, I will ask you my first question, which is around structuring the case. Typically, it's phrased something along the lines of what are the issues or areas that you would look into or want to explore to help the client answer their problem. Once I ask you this question, many candidates take the time to structure out their thoughts. Usually they take 1 to 2 minutes to structure stuff out on paper silently, and they present back their structure to me. After you present your structure, the case can take 2 different styles. If it's interviewer-led, which is the McKinsey style of interviews, then I will have a next question. I'll be like, hey, your structure is great. This is my next question for you. I will guide the case that's next step. If it's interviewee-led, so this is what Bain and BCG have a closer style to, then I'm going to ask you where you want to start, where you think is the first right area for us to look into to answer this question for the client. Regardless of what style the case is taking, you will after this point have some sort of quantitative question and some sort of qualitative question. The orders could be flipped. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to have at least one of each of these types of questions. So on the quantitative question, I might give you some additional information in the form of context, or I might give you some additional data in the form of a table, chart, graph for you to take a look at and then set up usually a multi-step quantitative problem for you to solve and then contextualize for the case. Usually this is multi-step. It takes a couple minutes to answer, and then I expect you to walk through the problem solving with me. After the quantitative, or sometimes before the quantitative question, you're going to have a qualitative question. This one is a little bit more straightforward. I'll ask you a question relevant to the overall context of the case, and we'll ask you to brainstorm a couple of ideas of what the client could do or what the client should consider to address the overall problem. And then these make up 2 of the core questions in the case. And then finally, once we cover the quantitative and the qualitative, some cases, not all, will end with the synthesis question, where I would ask you to basically synthesize what we've talked about so far for some sort of executive. And sometimes this question is framed along the lines of the CEO is about to walk into the room. What are the things you'd want to share with them about what we've learned so far? So that's the overall format of the case. Now let's walk into what are the specific questions and how to think about solving them. The qualitative question and the optional synthesis question at the end. So let's start with the structural question because it almost always comes first, and in my opinion, it's the most important of the 4 questions. So for this question, as a reminder, you've been asked to share a couple different areas to look into to answer the client's big question. Usually the way this question is answered is creating a couple different buckets or some sort of a flow chart of what are the areas you can look into. So some of the categories or buckets that you can start off the structure with would be things like competitors, market, profitability, customers, product. All of these could be relevant areas that you want to look into further, but you don't want to stop there. For each of these areas, you want 2 or 3 levels of depth around what exactly within this you'd want to look into. So for example, I could say that profitability is an area I'd want to look into. And then within profitability, I'd want to say, okay, profitability consists of revenue and cost. I know revenue is driven by price and volume. I think price is going to be super relevant for this case based on what we've heard so far. I know cost includes both fixed costs and variable costs. I actually think fixed costs is going to be super important because we want to know the upfront investment, for example, in entering this new market or creating this new product. So just to summarize, you have a couple different categories, and then you have a couple layers of depth within each one of these categories. And the balance here is making sure you cover all the important areas while not creating too generic of a framework. You want to include interesting details of things you've heard in the context or things from your own experience to make something like competition not feel super generic, but you want to make sure you're not missing something like profitability. That could be very crucial to the remaining questions on the case. So the next type of question is the math question. So at this point, I will be sharing with you some sort of table, chart, graph with some additional information for the most part. And then I will be asking you to set up a multi-step problem to answer the question. So I think some of the reasons why this is probably the scariest question on the case is 1, it is a multi-step problem. It's not just one quick math question. 2, you don't get a calculator, so you have to compute things by hand, which some people are a little bit out of practice with, understandably. And then 3rd, you have to walk the interviewer through your problem-solving process, not just do it silently and then kind of give them the answer at the end as if it was some sort of math exam. I think where I see people trip up the most is actually that third piece. You want to set up your logic and say, this is the way that I think I would set up this problem and answer it. And then you want to walk through each step of it. So for example, if I say that, okay, I think this is step 1, step 2, step 3, then I'd say, okay, for step 1, I know I need to multiply these two numbers. This is the output I'm getting. Sounds good with you? Okay, let me move on to step 2. That way, as an interviewer, I can make sure you're getting each one of the steps right. I have visibility into how you're thinking about solving the problem. And say you do have a little bit of a slip up, you miss a 0, you round incorrectly, then I can nudge you in the right direction and we can have more of a conversation about it, a problem-solving conversation about it, so that you get to the right answer. Remember, once you get to the answer, you want to contextualize it. So you can't just say, okay, the answer is 52. You want to say, the answer is 52, and what this means for the clients is that this is a good idea, or maybe we need more information, or maybe this makes it clear that there's huge risks for whatever the client is trying to do here, and they might need to reconsider it. Very often the next question, the qualitative question, piggybacks off the analysis that you do in the quantitative question. So maybe whatever outcome you have there, there's risks or other things that the client has to think about, and the interviewer might ask you to brainstorm a couple ideas. What I tell candidates here to aim for is somewhere between 5 to 7 ideas. You want to make sure you cover sort of the most important and obvious ideas, but you want to leave room for a couple of more creative ideas towards the end too. So things that could be just more creative, more interesting based on your experience, because this is where you can really separate yourself out and show that you have this creative aspect of your problem solving, as well as the quantitative and the structural that we've already covered. And then finally, with the synthesis question, the most important thing to highlight here is that this is a synthesis, not a summary. What you should try to do is create a recommendation here and say, based on everything we've seen, I think the recommendation or the answer to what the client is trying to solve here is XYZ. And I think this is the case because this is the answer we got in the math. This is the answer we got for qualitative, but maybe there's XYZ risks that we need to consider as well. Done. You don't have to walk through every detail of the math or every detail of your structure. You want to focus on what the recommendation is and why. Now that you know the questions in the case interview, let's talk about the third topic of how do you make your case interview shine or stand out. So I think there's a couple different things that go into this. The first thing that comes to mind is always contextualizing your answer. So whether it's the qualitative, the structural question, or especially on the quantitative question, always ending with how does this tie back to the big question that the client is trying to solve. Sometimes it could be helpful to write down what that big question is at the top of your page, so that when you're visually looking at the notes and stuff you have, you're always thinking of going back and tying everything you say back to what the big question is. This also makes it easier to synthesize your recommendation at the end because you've been thinking about the big question all along. The second thing is keeping the interview conversational. As I said before on the math, you don't want to treat this like an exam. You want to treat it as a collaborative problem-solving session with the interviewer. So they're giving you some information, you're sharing your ideas or your approach back with them, but you're having a conversation about it. And that way you are leaving room for them to redirect you or nudge you in a direction as well, versus going straight ahead with what the path you think is the right answer. I think this is important because it's also a gauge of how you'd want to problem solve with a client in an actual consulting job. So are you open to redirection? Are you open to new information? Are you open to asking for more information if you feel like you don't have all the information you need to answer the question? And then finally, I think it's important to be hypothesis driven. So rather than answer each question and say, okay, cool, I've answered the question, I'm done, you can give the context of how this ties back to the case, but you also maybe want to suggest where you could go next with it. So maybe on a math question, what this looks like is saying, we've gotten this answer, we know what this signifies for the case, we know this is good for the client, but to have a clear, super clear answer on that, I would want to look into this next, or I think I'd want to see if there's more data that we can dig into here, or I would want to explore this number here because I think that was a big assumption that we made to get to our answer. So doing all three of those things, contextualizing all your answers, keeping the interview conversational with your interviewee, and then being hypothesis driven, in your answers as well. I think all those things shows that the candidate is confident and familiar with the overall case interview process and is just putting in the extra effort, the extra sparkle to really make them stand out. Lastly, I want to leave you with some guidance on how to structure your preparation. I think of case interview preparation in 3 different phases. The first is understanding the case interview process itself, so understanding the format of the case and the types of questions, getting familiar with the flow. The second is getting just reps in on practice cases. And the third is building that final piece of confidence to make your case interview and case answers really shine. So on the first piece, understanding the format, you already have a head start on that, but there's also plenty of resources available online. Specifically, you should definitely take a look at the firms or the companies that you're applying to see if they have practice cases online or information online of how their case is formatted. This is an excellent resource and I think something that people often forget that they should use. Outside of that, there's a ton of different books. Case in Point is a very, very popular choice that shares different frameworks or different pieces of information about what a case interview is and what it's trying to help a consulting firm understand about you. Once you've done this, I think it's very important to jump into practice cases with a mentor, with a friend, and if needed, just by yourself, walking through them online and practicing answering the questions. The first couple are going to feel a little bit rough. Be patient, take your time, look at what the answers are and understand what you want to do next time. And then hopefully when you practice with a mentor or friend, you can ask them for feedback as well. But slowly you'll find that there's certain areas of the case, for example, the structure that you need a little bit extra support on. Don't be afraid to just focus in on that piece of the case and get in additional reps on just that portion. If you feel like that's a problem area for you, you can be more targeted on that. And there's plenty of cases online just to get those reps in on specific questions. If you find the math piece of it to be very challenging, there's also sources that you can go to just to practice your mental math or your handwritten math. Caseinterviewmath.com, I believe, is one of the ones that still exists where you can practice the math piece of it. And then finally, phase 3, making your interview shine, is where you get to be really creative. You're familiar with the process. You know what the case interview is. This is where you should really start incorporating, okay, this is an experience I have that I think could be relevant for this case. Let me figure out how I can incorporate some of those ideas. And maybe there's an idea I throw into the qualitative question or something that I put into my structure to make this shine. This is also where to focus on that contextualizing, conversational aspect of it and being hypothesis driven and not just answering the questions of the case. For me, I probably did about 20 or 25 practice interviews before going into my actual interviews with McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. I know for some people it takes them 10 and then they feel confident and they're ready to go. I know people who've also done 50 practice case interviews. I think you figure out what works best for you. Just think about the different phases and what you're trying to accomplish with that phase of your preparation and not spending too much time just familiarizing yourself and reading books, making sure you're going in and actually practicing cases, because that's going to be what gets you really prepared and really confident for the actual interview. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, I would appreciate if you liked and subscribed to make it easier for other people to find this video as they're preparing for their own case interviews. I've put 2 additional resources in the description box that I think that could be helpful for you. The first is a summarized guide of a lot of the things I've just talked through in the video today on Notion. It's just written down instead of video form in case that's more helpful to reference. And the second is a video that I've also created on my channel that's on the 5 most common mistakes I saw as part of the case interview process while I was an interviewer at McKinsey. If you have any questions or feedback on this video, I'd love for you to leave it in the comments below, and best of luck to you through the case interview process. Thanks.